Hello, everyone. As with the reading we looked at modern witchcraft, today we'll be establishing some background information in order to better understand what we saw in the reading. In order to do so, we'll be looking at three broad concepts that greatly affected political, economic, and the cultural atmosphere in the modern era. So these three broad concepts are globalization. In this, we're talking about how economies and politics and international relations all transcended colonialism during the 20th century and moved towards this globalist attitude that is currently still developing to this day, but really took root during the 20th century. And with that also came more movement towards secularity, which started to blossom during the Enlightenment era, but really took hold during the technological innovations seen during the 20th century. And then finally, something that must be touched on is the Cold War. Obviously, with all these, we'll be looking specifically at Western Europe and the United States, more so Western Europe than the United States. But we'll get started with globalization. Globalization is a relatively new concept that really started to take off during the 1970s and 80s. Basically, ever since technological innovations took off, there have been concerns about the world becoming a smaller place and the deconstruction of communities. We saw this sentiment when railways started to be developed globally. However, this really took on exponential growth during the 20th century as literally and figuratively the world did become a smaller place just due to the ability to travel to much different parts of the globe than would have been feasible for most people than ever before. Specifically, we're talking about air travel, which allowed people to travel across oceans in hours. In this, obviously, the world was becoming a smaller place, but as well with capitalist industrialization that really was finalizing during this time, we see economies start to rely on each other for development. Development of technologies obviously is much faster, and these innovations come much quicker. And with that, in the end of World War II, we see nations come together to try to prevent that sort of scenario from happening ever again. So we see these sort of union groups, such as the United Nations and the European Union, to counteract that. And with that, obviously, comes interconnected economies, which all kind of plays into this feeling of the world being a smaller place. With that is also a generalized movement towards secularity. In the political sphere, religion started to be less significant than before during the Enlightenment era, as liberal political theorists push more towards a separation between church and state, and new blossoming governments really took that to heart and put that into application. However, as we saw the inventions of the TV and later on cell phones, the world became even smaller, and there are even more distractions from religion, and governments at that point were, for the most part, in Western Europe and the United States, pretty separate in establishing religion as a heavy influence on policy. That's not to say that it didn't happen, it just means that it was going on to a lesser degree than ever before. And all of this is not to say that people on an independent basis were less religious than before. obviously, if you look at polls and just general numbers of people practicing religion is still significant today on a personal basis, but it has a much smaller impact socially and politically than it did before. And the church holds a lot less power than it has in the past, which obviously will have a great effect on witchcraft and how acceptable it is. And finally, one thing that has to be mentioned is the Cold War, which had a heavy influence on Western culture and, even more broadly speaking, global culture, as we saw this fight between the United States and the Soviet Union, United States and Western Europe, generally speaking, and the Soviet Union take place throughout multiple nations, even if they weren't directly connected to either the Soviet Union or the United States and the Western Europe states. During this, we saw a large cultural shift in America with a fascination with hidden actors, specifically on spy culture. A lot of movies came out at the time, as well as novels, focusing on spies. And with that, there also came a fascination with conspiracy theories and trying to attribute certain, let's say, evils to people without necessary truth. This is a more secular type of attributing evil than before, but there's obviously accusations of like underground satanic cults among elites. This is when all of this starts to really take ground and conspiracy theories become pretty popular. And that also has to do with actual conspiracies being exposed during the time. With this as well is how the Western Europe states and the United States really put an emphasis on the evils of far left politics and atheism. So, what happened during the Cold War was kind of an exasperation of globalization that kind of accelerated that process, which we touched on before, as these Western states tried to come together and counteract the growth of communism and the expansion of communism. And with that, we've covered significant background information for witchcraft and why we see what might help describe and explain certain aspects of witchcraft in the 20th century. Thank you.